The night air felt strangely heavy, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Streetlights flickered in a slow, rhythmic pulse, spreading warped shadows across pavement that had forgotten the warmth of sunlight. In that surreal glow, a single figure stood at the edge of a community he didn't belong to, at least, according to the woman who believed she owned every inch of the place. She had been watching him for weeks, her eyes sharp with the kind of entitlement that twists ordinary suspicion into something far darker. Her presence seeped into every corner of the block, an ever-present hum of control, policing where people walked, how they looked, and whether their skin fit the landscape she believed she was safeguarding. And though he lived far beyond the reach of her jurisdiction, she acted as though the invisible borders around her private little kingdom extended wherever she wished them to. The tension had been building like a storm trapped behind unbroken clouds. Each encounter added another fragile branch to the pile, one gust of wind away from a blaze. And on this particular evening, the sky carried a low, vibrating hum, the kind that makes people glance over their shoulders without knowing why. It whispered of unraveling, of a shift in balance, of a reckoning long overdue. When the legal notice arrived, stamped aggressively, mailed confidently, written with venom disguised as formality, it didn't surprise him. It was simply the moment the storm chose to burst open. She had sued him for living outside her homeowners association, sued him for not abiding by regulations that had never applied to him, sued him for daring to exist beyond the walls of her tightly controlled world. Her arrogance wasn't just personal, it was systemic. A layered structure built on generations of people who believed that power was theirs to distribute, to weaponize, to enforce. And she wielded it with a smile that hid the rot beneath the surface. Her lawsuit wasn't about property lines. It wasn't about rules. It was about dominance, about making sure people like him remained under someone's thumb, even if that thumb had no legal right to be there. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined in her most feverish attempts to control the world, was just how fragile her power truly was. The foundation of her precious association, the one she strutted around like a badge carved from marble, was built on paperwork older than her memory, on loopholes she didn't understand, on laws she assumed tilted in her favor simply because they always had before. And in the deep silence of that night, beneath the flickering streetlights and the suffocating tension, a realization was forming. Not for her, but for him. A path of quiet retribution. A legal blade sharper than anything she carried. In 3 minutes, less time than it took her to rehearse one of her condescending neighborhood speeches, everything she relied on would crumble. Her authority. Her control. Her illusion of superiority. Because while she believed she was dragging him into a battle she could not lose, she had unknowingly handed him the very tool that would end her kingdom altogether. The storm was coming, and she was standing directly in its path. Hit subscribe, watch till the end. The morning after the lawsuit arrived, the world felt colder, sharper, as if the air itself carried judgment. The neighborhood stretched out in its usual quiet perfection, trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, identical expectations, but the illusion of harmony had thinned to a translucent film. Beneath it, resentment pulsed like a heartbeat. He walked through his own property, land untouched by any association, yet somehow treated as a threat simply because he existed outside the boundaries someone else had drawn. Every tree, every fence post, every patch of soil held a piece of his history, years of labor, care, and quiet resilience. But to the woman who had targeted him, none of that mattered. In her eyes, his presence disrupted the image she wanted to preserve, a curated landscape where only the familiar and acceptable could thrive. Rumors had spread quickly once she set her sights on him. Neighbors whispered, glancing over shoulders, trying to avoid the confrontation brewing at their doorstep. Some avoided eye contact out of discomfort, others out of silent agreement with her beliefs. It wasn't just about property lines, it was about the unspoken rules of belonging, the ones enforced not by law but by prejudice disguised as community concern. He had seen it before. The subtle distancing. The suspicious glances. The fabricated complaints. The way people clung to their comfort by policing those who didn't mirror their image of what the neighborhood should look like. It was a pattern woven through generations, surviving in every place that pretended to be fair while quietly choosing favorites. Yet there was something different this time, something the woman couldn't sense through her cloud of entitled certainty. Unlike others she'd targeted, he had no intention of bowing, retreating, or letting her reshape his reality. He had learned long ago that silence only fed people like her. And though he carried himself with quiet strength, behind that calm exterior was a mind sharp enough to dismantle the very structure she believed protected her. Her lawsuit, crafted with arrogance and ignorance, had given him more than a legal burden. It had given him access. A window into the fragile skeleton of the association she worshipped. A chance to expose the rot she pretended didn't exist. What she saw as a challenge was becoming his opportunity. And while she prepared for a battle she thought she'd already won, he was quietly preparing to take away the one thing she valued most, her power. The unraveling had already begun. The lawsuit became more than paper. It became a shadow trailing him everywhere he went. Even outside her territory, the accusation tried to paint him as an intruder in a place he had built with his own hands. The more he read through the claims, crafted with smug overconfidence, the more he understood how deeply her entitlement ran. She had filed it not because she believed she would win, but because she believed he would yield. But instead of intimidation, the pages sparked something far stronger. Embedded within the legal nonsense, he discovered inconsistencies. Outdated signatures. Expired documents. Missing approvals. It was as if the association had been coasting for years, propped up only by the obedience of residents who never questioned its authority. The woman, fueled by superiority, had never imagined that someone would actually look closely at the structure she treated as untouchable. He spent long nights reviewing every detail, tracing the history of the organization, uncovering layer after layer of neglected paperwork. What emerged was a picture of an entity that had been dead on arrival for years, operating out of habit rather than legitimacy. The board members listed were no longer active. The foundational charter had quietly expired. The association existed only in the minds of those who feared it. His discovery wasn't merely legal, it was cultural. It reflected a pattern that stretched far beyond property lines. Systems created by those in power, maintained through silence, and enforced disproportionately against those who were simply easier to target. It reminded him of countless stories buried beneath society's surface, where prejudice hid behind rules, policies, and manufactured authority. As he dug deeper, the weight of what he'd uncovered settled over him like gathering clouds before a storm. For years, the woman had exercised control over residents, policing their homes, their yards, even their appearances, all while her authority was nothing more than a ghost of paperwork long forgotten. Her obsession with him was simply the latest expression of a system she believed she embodied. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating throughout the neighborhood. People sensed tension in the air without knowing its cause. Her presence grew even more frantic, patrolling boundaries, enforcing imaginary rules, trying to maintain the illusion of order. But cracks had formed. A sense of unease crept through the community, a quiet recognition that something was shifting. He moved silently, gathering evidence, documenting every inconsistency, preparing a response not born from anger but from precision. The woman had wanted a conflict. What she had unknowingly created was an opportunity for a reckoning. Each passing day tightened the coil around her authority. Every new piece of evidence was another blow to the foundation she didn't know was crumbling. And while she prepared to escalate her crusade, unaware of how exposed she truly was, he prepared something far more powerful. Not a counterattack. A complete erasure of the system she used to justify her prejudice. The storm she had summoned was no longer approaching. It was forming right beneath her feet. The day of the hearing arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that feels engineered by fate rather than weather. Dawn spread thin light across the landscape, revealing a neighborhood holding its breath, waiting for a confrontation it didn't yet understand. For years, the woman had ruled the community like a monument carved from self-appointed authority. But for the first time, her confidence wavered beneath the subtle tremors of something she couldn't see, something she didn't realize was already dismantling her kingdom. He entered the room with quiet composure, carrying nothing more than a stack of documents worn from countless nights of scrutiny. She arrived with the smug certainty of someone who had never been challenged, shoulders lifted, gaze sharp with the belief that the system would bend as it always had. Yet beneath her polished posture, there was a faint, almost imperceptible flicker, an unrest she couldn't name. As the proceedings began, the weight of truth settled between them like a blade suspended in air. She expected compliance, expected him to shrink beneath the legal jargon she'd weaponized. But instead, he unfolded his findings with calm precision, revealing each piece with the cold clarity of a surgeon cutting away diseased flesh. One by one, the layers of her supposed authority peeled away. The expired charter, the missing renewals, the inactive board, the years of unfiled reports. The association she had used to police her neighbors with racial bias and manufactured superiority had not legally existed for longer than anyone realized. It was nothing more than a hollow structure suspended by fear and compliance. Each revelation struck her like a blow she'd never trained for. The confidence she wore like armor began to fracture, her posture stiffening as her imagined power drained through the cracks. She searched for footing, for loopholes, for the familiar cushion of privilege that had always caught her. But this time, there was nothing beneath her, no structure to uphold her authority, no system to support her assumptions. For the first time, she was forced to stand on the same ground as those she had targeted. The final document landed like a verdict crafted by the truth itself, the legal dissolution of the association, triggered by the very lawsuit she had filed. Her attempt to dominate him had set in motion the destruction of the institution she worshipped. What she believed was an act of enforcement had become an act of self-destruction. A silence followed that felt heavier than sound. The room seemed to tilt, the air thick with the collapse of a hierarchy she thought was permanent. She stood frozen, stripped of the authority she had used to shield her prejudice, her empire evaporating before she could grasp it. He didn't revel in her downfall. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the steady resolve of someone who understood the weight of justice. The moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth correcting a long-standing imbalance. And in that single, irreversible instant, the power she clung to for years dissolved. Exactly 3 minutes after she tried to use it against him, in the weeks that followed, the community settled into an uneasy quiet, one shaped not by enforced rules, but by the aftermath of a truth too large to ignore. The dissolution had undone more than a homeowners association. It had exposed the architecture of prejudice that many had allowed to stand simply because it had always stood. Without the illusion of authority holding everything in place, the neighborhood had to confront the uncomfortable void left behind. Some residents walked with a new sense of freedom, discovering relief in the absence of unsolicited surveillance. Others moved more cautiously, unsettled by the realization that they had accepted control without questioning its origins. They had followed directives not because they believed in them, but because they assumed someone else had the right to issue them. The collapse of the association stripped away the comforting idea that order had been built on fairness. Instead, it revealed how deeply people can internalize systems that do not serve them, simply because those systems favor certain faces, certain voices, certain skin. For him, the days after the hearing were a strange blend of peace and reflection. He returned to the rhythm of his life, but the experience lingered like a bruise beneath the surface. The battle had never been about property lines or regulations. It had been about the entitlement that allowed someone to believe they could reach beyond their borders and claim ownership over him. It had been about the quiet, persistent racism that disguises itself as rules, procedures, and community standards. He didn't celebrate his victory, because victories in situations like these were never clean. They carried the weight of histories that stretched far beyond one neighborhood dispute. Still, he recognized the significance of what had happened. By dismantling the false authority that had targeted him, he had shattered a pattern that might have continued unchecked, affecting others who lacked the resources or resilience to challenge it. As the days turned, the community's behavior shifted in subtle ways. People who once averted their eyes now offered hesitant nods. The absence of surveillance softened the atmosphere. Without someone policing their appearances and identities, residents seemed almost surprised by how normal life felt. The fear that had once governed their actions dissipated, leaving behind the uncomfortable truth that the only thing enforcing the association's power, if a system can crumble this easily, was it ever real? Or did people simply believe in it because it protected the few while constraining the many? And with that question echoing through the quiet streets, the story settled into its final truth. Real change doesn't begin when injustice is exposed. It begins when people refuse to accept it anymore.